and welcome to part 2 of The Plain Truth. Joining me again, it's the awesome Captain Al. Hi, Captain Al.
Hello, Matt. How are you?
Oh, living the dream, living the dream. Now, one of the things that I've seen lots of what I can only describe as dramatic videos, shall we say, we'll call them dramatic videos, of planes in flight being struck by lightning. And one of the questions that's always been bugging me in the back of my mind, basically, is if an aeroplane is struck in the air by lightning, what effect does that have, like, on things like the electronic systems and the way that the plane flies? And have you had a lightning strike in your time in the air?
Okay, well, the first thing I'll say is that lightning strikes to aeroplanes look far more spectacular to the people on the ground looking at them than they do to the people on the aeroplane. In fact, when I've had lightning strikes, the majority of passengers weren't even aware that it took place. And I'm not kidding you there. That's just how it is. I'm not trying to downplay this. So when lightning hits an aeroplane, and maybe we'll talk a little bit afterwards about how this kind of happens and what we do to mitigate it. But when the lightning hits the aeroplane, and it's usually kind of like on the pointy bits, so it looks for a sharp edge, so usually on the wings or the tail or somewhere like that, or occasionally at the front of the aircraft. All that really happens is that if you happen to be looking in the direction of where the lightning came from, you'll see a white flash, no great surprise there, and you'll hear a bang. And truthfully, it's no really different to the sort of noise that you might hear if one of the cabin crew drop a teapot in the galley or something like that. So we're not talking about anything deafening. It's loud enough to notice, but it's not going to deafen you. The lightning will enter the aeroplane. Sometimes you can have multiple strikes. Usually it's a single strike. So there'll be an entry hole. And I'll talk a bit about the hole aspect shortly. So the lightning will enter the aircraft, pass part of the way through the fuselage. So I want you to think of the fuselage as like a cage for the lightning to travel through, and then it will leave the aircraft. And quite often it will leave by different pathways. And what you'll find is after a lightning strike, there'll be on the fuselage of the aircraft tiny little sort of pinprick holes and a little bit of sort of like scorching or charring. That sounds quite severe, doesn't it? It's not, because aeroplanes, by their very design, and we're not talking Hollywood here where someone shoots a gun in an aeroplane and everyone is sucked out. Aeroplanes, by their very design and nature, are not airtight. So there's lots of leaks in aeroplanes. Usually the lightning strikes happen to parts of the aircraft that aren't pressurized anyway. So they're inconsequential. Of course, they need to be repaired, but it's very akin to having a pinprick hole on an ocean-going liner. You're not going to sink. So that's kind of what tends to happen. Usually, that is the total drama for the pilots. Occasionally, depending on where the lightning strikes, you may have a computer system that goes offline and needs to be reset. I've had, I think, about 6 lightning strikes in 20 years. And in all bar one of those, there was absolutely no event whilst we were in flight. So if you have a computer that just briefly goes offline, it will either self-reset or it will require the pilots to reset it. So that's basically the event. When the aircraft's landed, there are some maintenance checks that have to be carried out. One of those involves checking that the compass is still correctly aligned, because you can have a situation where after a lightning strike, the electric field from the lightning causes the compass to become misaligned. So that's one of the things that the engineers will do. They'll also look at the little exit and entry holes and make sure that they're not in anywhere important. Sometimes if they're in a sensitive area, maybe near some probes, or indeed they did occur to one of the pressurized areas, they'll put a patch over it. Now, I'm not talking about a bit of sort of rubber or latex with some glue here. They tend to be aluminium or titanium, and they're riveted onto the side of the fuselage. And if you look on an airplane that's maybe had a strike or a ding, you'll see these little patches on the aircraft, and they typically stay there either till the next major check, or indeed for the duration of the aircraft life. They're not a problem. It's not a big deal. So aircraft manufacturers spend a lot of time trying to minimize the strikes that aircraft have, because although they don't represent any great threat to the aircraft, they do temporarily ground the aircraft for a maintenance check. So one of the things that they do is all on the design. So obviously aluminium's a very good conductor. So if you're going to get hit by lightning, then the lightning will travel around the aluminium or through the aluminium and leave the aircraft. The reason that aircraft get struck, by the way, is because they're flying fast through the air. They generate friction and therefore static. So it's inevitable that in similar sort of way to, like you do that trick with a balloon where you rub it against your chest and then put it against or near your hair, and your hair sort of stands up on end.
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of similar to that as to why aircraft become statically charged. Next time you're near a large aeroplane, if you have a look on the trailing edge of the wings and on the tail, you won't see the tail, you'll see little sort of floppy bits of, black plasticky looking things. They're about the size of a drinking straw. They're actually called static wicks, and they are designed to allow the aircraft to discharge as much of its static charge as possible. So these are all trying to minimize the likelihood of being struck by lightning. And then there are certain bits of the aircraft that can't be made out of aluminium. So the nose cone, that's where the weather radar sits. So obviously you can't have a weather radar behind aluminium because it wouldn't be very effective. So that tends to be made out of carbon fiber. Same with the fuselage of the Boeing 787. That's largely carbon fiber. So what the aircraft manufacturers do is they bond within the carbon fiber strips of metal. Again, same principle. Lightning hits the airplane, goes down these strips of metal and leaves the aircraft.
You mentioned there, obviously, that it looks for like sharp edges and all that kind of thing, and you did sort of mention often that the wings are often caught. Now, my understanding is that the fuel is essentially stored in the wings. It's essentially the wings become the fuel tanks. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. So that within the wings are fuel tanks. So first of all, the fuel in there, it's not petrol. It's Jet A or Jet A1, kerosene by another name. And if you were to take a jug of kerosene and drop a lighted match into it, what do you think would happen?
Well, I mean, I would assume that it would just go boof and up in a big ball of flames.
No, the match will extinguish. So in a very similar sort of way, remember kerosene is not as sophisticated as diesel that you put in your car. So kerosene only burns under certain circumstances. It has to be pressurized, etc. Same as diesel, really. So what we're talking about really is something that, yes, it will explode, but with regards to lightning, all around the fuel tanks are basically a framework of metal that will deflect any of the lightning away from the fuel tanks.
What experiences have you had of lightning strikes? Have they been dramatic in any way, or have they all been sort of fairly non-events?
All bar one of them was a complete and utter non-event in the air. The one that wasn't a big deal, actually. It just demagnetized our standby compass. So modern airliners have fairly sort of sophisticated gyroscopic or GPS-based navigation systems. So we're not reliant on your sort of like typical magnetic compass, but we have a very basic magnetic compass as a standby compass. And when you looked at that after the lightning strike, it was just sort of spinning around because it was no longer magnetized
no longer
in the
working.
same way.
Yeah.
Yeah. And bearing in mind that is the standby compass. So the primary compasses, I was going to say compi then, but I think the plural's compasses, were all working fine. It was just the standby compass that was affected.
Wow. So, I mean, from my point of view, obviously, what you've described sounds very terrifying, but actually the event itself is really of no consequence to the aircraft in the main.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm genuinely telling you that the majority of the passengers don't even know it's happened. One thing I will say about lightning, though, and this is especially true if you're flying at night, if we're flying above or clouds that have lightning, or if you see lightning at night time, because it's very bright, tends to look very, very close. And I can tell you that it's nowhere near as close as you think. So I've had cabin crew come to me and say, a couple of passengers have asked about the storm. And I go, yes. So I say to the cabin crew, of course, reasonably experienced at these things, how far away do you think that storm is? And they go, I don't know, 3-4 miles. And I go, okay, no, I'll put it up on the weather radar here. And I'll go, yeah, it's 140 miles away.
Oh, wow. And I suppose because it's nighttime, essentially, the brightness of said storm is very much amplified, so you can see it from...
Absolutely,
there's nothing to get in your way up there, of course.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in a similar vein, I've heard, had cabin crew who've come to me and say, we heard a bit of a bang. Do you know anything about that? So that's far removed from the cabin crew coming in and screaming, saying, honestly, like I said at the very beginning, it can look quite spectacular to people on the ground, but it doesn't look spectacular to those people who are on the aeroplane. Honest, Gov.
That's a great place to end. Thanks, Captain Al.
My pleasure.